So let's dive into this government property reporting topic and why it's so critical. And to begin, let me first comment on a bit of background around the need to identify assets. As we know, military standard 130 is really behind this whole IUID policy when considering the qualifying assets that require a unique identifier, which of course, as we all know here, is a global serialized identifier that's unique unto itself to the part in which it's being applied. But government property reporting has evolved too over the past 5 years. And during that time, these DoD e-commerce systems have been evolving to also incorporate the need for assets to be part of these transactions. Something as simple as invoicing now has to include not only the CLIN level detail, but also the UID level asset identification and its pedigree that would go along with the invoice associated with that end item deliverable going to the government. Same thing as it applies to property and custody transfers and even other life cycle events when property is moving back and forth or in your possession if you're a contractor. So at this point, I'm going to ask Darryl, you to comment specifically about government furnished property under contract for these requirements. On the contractor side, where does this leave property managers? And on the government side, where does this leave logisticians when we talk about their obligations to identify, mark, track, and report property here in 2017?
Yeah, okay, Pete. You know, with the FIAR deadline coming later this year in October, that's where if you know contractors and government agencies that have certain DFARS clauses in their contracts, 252, 211, 703, and 707 for IUID and government property, then they have an obligation to do this reporting. And even though this compliance, this IUID, this Mill Standard 130 compliance has been around for, you know, a number of years, really dating back to around 2004, you know, there's been more focus on it, and there's certainly going to be a lot more pressure applied. You know, in the early days where items had to be greater than $5,000 or mission critical or serialized, you know, they've broadened the breadth of items that need to be reported to inventory or material and non-UII government furnished property. So just the broad breadth of items that now fall under this guideline is so much larger, than it becomes a much more difficult task to accomplish. So, you know, automation and having the proper systems in place and the proper training in place is really going to be imperative to being successful in meeting those obligations.
Yeah, and you know, as Darryl was mentioning, he went from government property, which now includes material and equipment. You know, it kind of forces property management personnel to acquire, you know, a reputable and proven system, and not only just a proven system for managing property, but one that harnesses that auto ID technology for barcode scanning. You mentioned RFID before, you know, when we were starting off this webinar, which we'll get into a little more in detail later on. But it really forces them into inquiring something real reputable that helps them meet all these new property management requirements.
Yeah, and you know, we've spoken about FIAR here, and that's where I want to focus some attention next relative to this whole FIAR initiative, Financial Improvement and Audit Readiness FIAR, of course. And what we see on this chart, it's a little bit of an eye chart, I recognize, but back here in fiscal year 2013, let's see if I can get a little highlighter going here. But in 2013 began wave one, where based on the kind of financial requirements, whether it's using general funds or working capital funds, there was some preparedness that went on in 13 and into 14 of course, all the while, this requirement here in which to maintain property accountability and be able to report not only assets but items in inventory to the existence and completeness of those books, and being able to report that through to the various DoD systems such as the IUID registry, because what's happening is these accountable property systems of record that are being maintained by these branches of services are pulling from the IUID registry in order to make sure that they are in fact audit ready come October 1st here in this calendar year, right? And so that's the significance of going from this wave 4 here in FY17 to basically FY18, which, as we know, is gonna tick over here this year. So the DoD wants to be prepared for this full financial statement audit, and that means that they're going to send the auditors out to assure that not only are the financial transactions flowing properly, but also that property itself is being accounted for in its completeness. So, I think that, getting back to how does that impact our community here today, to put a fine point on it, we're talking about item unique identification when it comes to those qualifying assets, right? And making sure that your property is in fact being reported through to the IUID registry. And any new contracts you take on, when you take on that obligation as a custodian, you got to make sure that you get it reported.